In a single year, 2 acts of Parliament ended a system of authority that had shaped the Scottish Highlands for 400 years. Before that year, a clan chief could try a man in his own private court, on his own land, and pass a sentence with no appeal to any judge in Edinburgh or London. After it, he could not so much as fine a tenant for stealing a sheep without going through the same courts as any other landowner in Britain. This change in law did not, by itself, remove a single family from a single acre of ground. But it took away something a chief had relied on for centuries, the reason he had ever needed to keep his tenants close, fed, and willing to fight for him. Over the century that followed, that missing reason would empty valleys that had been continuously inhabited since before written record, and scatter the descendants of the people who left across 4 continents. This account follows the sequence of decisions that produced that outcome. On estates across Sutherland, Ross-shire, Argyll, Inverness-shire, and the Hebrides, from the middle of the 18th century into the closing years of the 19th. It does not begin with an eviction. It begins on a stretch of open moorland outside Inverness, on a spring morning in 1746, with a battle that lasted less than an hour. This is quiet history at bedtime. If this is the kind of story that holds your attention, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this account comes from government archives, legislative records, and current academic research on the period. Just relax and let this play as you drift into sleep. Now, let us begin. Before 1746, the Highlands of Scotland operated on a structure of obligation that had almost nothing to do with money. A clan chief did not simply own land in the way an English gentleman owned an estate. He held it, in theory, on behalf of his people, and in exchange, his tenants owed him service, military service above all. A man who farmed a chief's land in Lochaber, or Badenoch, was, in effect, also a soldier who could be called up within days. This is why Highland regiments could be raised so quickly, and why Highland armies could appear on a battlefield within weeks of a chief's decision to fight. Beneath the chief sat a layer of minor gentry called tacksmen, who held large blocks of land directly from the chief, and then sublet smaller parcels to the ordinary tenants below them. Tacksmen collected rents, organized labor, and, critically, recruited and led the fighting men when the chief called. They were the administrative middle layer of the clan system, and their loyalty to the chief was almost always kinship-based rather than contractual. Rent, where it existed at all, was frequently paid in kind, in cattle, in grain, in labor, rather than in coin, because coin itself was scarce in a region with almost no towns, no banks, and very little cash economy. A chief's wealth was measured less by money in hand than by the number of men who would answer when he called them out. This structure had already begun to strain under its own weight well before 1745. Highland estates were, in purely economic terms, poor. The land was mountainous, the growing season short, and the population, while smaller in total than the lowlands, was still pressing against the limits of what subsistence farming on that terrain could support. A poor harvest year in the 1740s, of the kind that recurred periodically across the region, could reduce entire districts to dependence on meal brought in from the lowlands, and the government body established in 1727 to encourage Highland fisheries and manufactures. The Board of Trustees for Fisheries, Manufactures and Improvements had, by the 1740s, achieved only limited success in developing alternative sources of income for a population still overwhelmingly dependent on cattle and grain. A census organized in 1755 by the minister Alexander Webster, the first reasonably systematic population count of Scotland as a whole, recorded roughly 1.25 million people across the country, with the Highland counties accounting for a substantial share of that total, despite containing only a fraction of Scotland's cultivable land. That imbalance, a large population concentrated on a small proportion of usable farmland, was already visible to contemporary observers within a decade of Culloden, and it would only grow more pronounced as the population continued to rise through the second half of the century. Cattle, not sheep, were the primary commercial export of the pre-clearance Highland economy, driven each autumn along drove roads to markets such as the Great Cattle Tryst at Falkirk, in central Scotland, where Highland cattle changed hands by the tens of thousands for eventual sale into the English market. This droving trade generated real income for Highland estates, but it required comparatively little labor once the herds were gathered, and it coexisted easily with a dense tenant population still farming small arable plots alongside their cattle grazing, a balance that the coming shift toward sheep would upend entirely. Chiefs who wanted the comforts increasingly common among the Scottish and English gentry, better houses, education for their sons in Edinburgh or on the continent, fashionable clothing, imported wine, needed cash, and their estates were not generating much of it. Some chiefs had already begun raising rents in the decades before Culloden, and some tacksmen had already begun to feel squeezed between a chief who wanted more and tenants who had nothing more to give. The Jacobite Rising of 1745 did not create this tension. It gave the British government both the opportunity and the justification to dismantle the political structure that had let the tension go unresolved for so long. The structure that let a chief extract loyalty and manpower without ever needing to pay for either. Charles Edward Stuart landed on the west coast of Scotland in July 1745, and by September his army had taken Edinburgh without a fight. Over the following months, Jacobite forces marched as far south as Derby in central England, before retreating north under pressure and under the discouragement of a promised French invasion that never arrived. By the spring of 1746, the Jacobite army had fallen back into the Highlands, exhausted, underfed, and increasingly divided over strategy between its senior commanders. On the morning of April 16, 1746, that army, numbering close to 5,000 men, met a government force of roughly 9,000 on Drumossie Moor, near Inverness, a stretch of open, boggy ground that gave no advantage to the fast, close-quarters charge that Highland regiments relied on. The battle lasted less than an hour. Jacobite casualties are estimated at between 1,500 and 2,000 men killed, against government losses usually put at around 50. What followed the battle mattered more, in the long run, than the battle itself. Government forces under the Duke of Cumberland spent the following months conducting punitive operations across the Highlands, burning farms, seizing livestock, and executing men suspected of having fought for the Stuart cause, whether or not clear evidence existed against them. Contemporary military correspondence from this period records units moving systematically through Lochaber, Badenoch, and parts of Inverness-shire, with orders to destroy the dwellings and livestock of any family connected, however loosely, to a Jacobite regiment. This period, remembered in some accounts as the pacification, was not a legal process carried out under any recognizable judicial procedure. It was a military occupation of a region the government now regarded as a permanent security threat, and it set the tone for the legislation that followed within the year. Among the chiefs and gentry who had led men out for the Stuart cause, several never regained their land at all. Donald Cameron of Lochiel, whose family had led the Camerons of Lochaber for generations, died in exile in France in 1748, and his estates were forfeited to the crown rather than passed to his heirs. Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, chief of Clan Fraser, was captured, tried before the House of Lords, and beheaded on Tower Hill in London in April 1747, the last person in Britain to be executed by that method, and his estate was forfeited in the same manner. These forfeitures, and others like them across roughly a dozen estates, became the core of the annexed estates program described later in this account. Land taken not through purchase or ordinary inheritance, but through the direct legal consequence of a lost war, and placed under a form of management no private Highland estate had previously experienced. Parliament passed the Act of Prescription in 1746, which included the Dress Act, banning the wearing of Highland dress, the kilt, the plaid, tartan cloth generally, for any man not serving in the British Army. The same broader legislative program disarmed the Highlands, making it illegal for most men in the region to own a sword, a gun, or a dirk, with search parties authorized to enter homes and confiscate weapons on suspicion alone. These measures targeted the visible symbols and the physical means of Highland military capacity. The ban on Highland dress remained in force for 36 years, until Parliament repealed it in 1782, by which point an entire generation had grown up in the Highlands never having legally worn the tartan their grandfathers had worn into battle at Culloden. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1747 targeted something less visible but structurally far more important: the legal authority that let a chief function as judge, jailer, and enforcer on his own land. Before this act, a chief holding what was called heritable jurisdiction could try tenants for offenses ranging from theft to murder in his own court, under his own procedure, with no requirement to refer the case to any crown court. This authority had nothing to do with rent or ownership in the strict sense. It was a separate, inherited legal power, distinct from the land itself, and it was one of the primary tools that let a chief command obedience without needing to pay for it. The 1747 Act abolished these jurisdictions across Scotland, transferring all criminal and civil authority to the Crown's own courts, administered by judges with no personal or clan loyalty to the families appearing before them. In compensation, the government paid affected chiefs and landowners a combined sum of £152,237 distributed among 51 claimants according to the assessed value of the jurisdiction each had lost. The Duke of Argyll received the largest single award, a sum in excess of £21,000, reflecting the scale of his family's historic legal authority across much of the Western Highlands. This detail is not a footnote. It is the point at which the transformation of the Highland chief from clan father to commercial landlord became financially real, rather than simply legal. a chief who received several £1,000s in a single payment, a sum many times larger than most Highland estates generated from rent in a decade, now held liquid capital in a way his family had rarely, if ever, held it before. Some used this money to pay off long-standing debts, often owed to Edinburgh or London merchants and lenders, debts accumulated over years of maintaining a gentleman's lifestyle on an estate that produced mostly cattle and oats. Others used it to invest, and increasingly, in the second half of the 18th century, the most attractive investment available to a Highland landowner was not more soldiers and more loyal tenants. It was livestock, specifically sheep, and specifically a hardy new breed suited to Highland terrain that could be raised in vast numbers with very few shepherds, a development that belongs to the next stage of this account. A second, quieter development followed close behind the compensation payments, and it came not from private landowners, but from the government itself. Following Culloden, the estates of Jacobite landowners judged guilty of treason were forfeited to the crown, rather than passed to their heirs in the ordinary way. Parliament placed 13 of these forfeited estates under the management of a body called the Commissioners for the Annexed Estates, established by statute in 1752 and given a mandate that read, in its own official language, as the promotion of what the commissioners called civilization and industry among the Highland population. Over the following 3 decades, until the estates were finally returned to the original families in 1784, the commissioners funded schools, built roads, financed experimental fisheries and small linen manufactories, and encouraged tenants to adopt farming methods drawn from the Scottish lowlands rather than the run-rig system of shared, rotated strips of arable land that had dominated Highland agriculture for centuries. On the forfeited Lochiel estate in Lochaber, the commissioners established a spinning school intended to train local women in linen production for sale outside the region, while on the forfeited Barrisdale estate on the west coast, they experimented with a herring fishing station intended to draw tenants away from subsistence farming toward a wage-earning trade tied to an external market. These experiments produced mixed results, and many of the specific ventures, including the Barrisdale fishery, failed within a few years of being established, undone by distance from major markets, unreliable shipping, and a workforce with little prior experience in the trades the commissioners were attempting to introduce. What the Annexed Estates program left behind was not, primarily, a set of successful industries. It was a vocabulary and a precedent, the idea that a Highland estate could be deliberately, systematically reorganized from above, in the name of improvement, by men who did not live on the land and answered to no one who did. That vocabulary would resurface, in far more consequential form, on private estates within a single generation. The tacksman felt the earliest and most direct effects of the changes already underway by the 1750s and 1760s. As chiefs began revising leases in the years after 1747, tacksmen, the middle layer of gentry who had organized recruitment and collected rents on the chief's behalf, increasingly found their own leases renewed at sharply higher rates, or not renewed at all. Their traditional function, providing military manpower on demand, had no remaining value to a government that had just spent a fortune ensuring no Highland chief could ever raise a private army again. Without that function, a tacksman was, in the eyes of an estate now thinking in terms of profit and loss, simply another tenant occupying land that might generate more income under a different arrangement. Some tacksmen responded by emigrating themselves, often taking groups of their own subtenants with them to North America in the 1760s and 1770s, in movements that would later be counted among the earliest waves of what became, by the 19th century, a much larger and more sustained emigration. One of the earliest and most heavily documented of these voyages left Loch Broom on the northwest coast in July 1773, when a ship called the Hector sailed for Pictou in Nova Scotia, carrying close to 200 passengers, most of them displaced tenants and small tacksmen from the surrounding districts of Ross Shire and Sutherland. The voyage took 11 weeks, considerably longer than expected, and outbreaks of dysentery and smallpox aboard the crowded ship killed at least 18 passengers, most of them children, before the Hector reached Pictou Harbor in September of that year. Those who survived the crossing arrived to find that the land they had been promised was, in large part, unfinished forest rather than cleared farmland, and the community's first winter in Nova Scotia was marked by severe hardship before the settlement stabilized in the years that followed. The Hector's passenger list, preserved in later Nova Scotian records, would come to be treated by their descendants much as the Mayflower's passenger list was treated in New England, a founding document of a diaspora community that grew over the following century into one of the largest concentrations of Highland Scottish settlement anywhere outside Scotland itself. A different kind of tacksman emigration took shape further south, on the west coast, where a Catholic tacksman named John MacDonald of Glenaladale organized and personally financed the purchase of land on St. John's Island, later renamed Prince Edward Island, in British North America. In 1772, MacDonald led roughly 210 tenants from his own lands and neighboring estates across the Atlantic, motivated in part by the same rising rents affecting tacksmen elsewhere, and in part by continuing legal restrictions on Catholic worship that made emigration to a colony offering greater religious freedom attractive to Catholic Highland communities in particular. Glenaladale's settlement succeeded where many others struggled, in large part because he had purchased the land outright, rather than relying on promises from a colonial land company, and the community he established became one of the founding populations of what remains, to the present day, one of the more concentrated areas of Highland Scottish Catholic heritage in Canada. Others stayed and adapted, becoming estate factors, the very administrators who would, within a generation, be issuing eviction notices to the same communities their own families had once led into battle. One such transition, recorded in fragmentary form in surviving estate papers from Inverness-shire, describes a tacksman family that held a substantial tack across 3 generations, providing fighting men to their chief in every conflict from the 1715 rising onward, only to receive notice in 1768 that their lease would not be renewed at its existing rent and would instead be offered to the highest bidder at the next term. The family's response, an appeal to the chief on the basis of generations of service, went unanswered in the surviving correspondence, and the tack passed within 2 years to a sheep farmer from the Scottish borders who had never set foot in the glen before signing the lease. Whether this specific family's outcome was typical in every detail is impossible to confirm from a single surviving record, but the pattern it illustrates, tacksmen with generations of service losing ground to commercial tenants with capital and no local ties, recurs across estate after estate in the documentary record of this period. By the early 1760s, the legal and financial foundation for a fundamentally different kind of Highland estate was already in place, tested in a limited way by the Crown's own annexed estates commissioners, and available in full to any private landowner willing to apply the same commercial logic without the government's caution. The chiefs still held their land. The old obligations that had once tied that land to a population of soldiers no longer carried any enforceable weight. What remained was a question that would have made no sense to any of their grandfathers. Not how many men a glen could raise, but how many pounds sterling it could be made to yield, and by what means that yield might be maximized. A handful of landowners had already begun to answer that question in a small way, leasing isolated hill pastures to lowland graziers on an experimental basis, watching the rent those pastures returned, and comparing it quietly against the far smaller sums their tenant townships had ever produced. That comparison, repeated on estate after estate through the 1760s, would not stay quiet for long. It would be answered in full by factors walking the hills with a very different kind of expert at their side, men who understood not soldiers but sheep. A handful of experimental leases in the 1760s were enough to convince a growing number of Highland landowners that the old way of measuring their land had been wrong for a very long time. For 400 years, the value of Highland land had been measured in men, how many tenants it could support, and how many of those tenants could be called into arms. The new measurement that replaced it was borrowed directly from the commercial economy of lowland Scotland and England, annual rental income, calculated in pounds sterling per acre. Two developments in the second half of the 18th century made this new measurement practical on a large scale, and both involved turning Highland land into a source of a specific commodity that lowland and English markets wanted badly. The first was wool, and more specifically, a breed of sheep called the Cheviot. The Cheviot had been developed in the border hills between Scotland and England, and it had a critical advantage over the small, native Highland cattle that had dominated the region's agriculture for centuries. It could survive the winter outdoors on rough hill pasture with minimal shelter, minimal feeding, and minimal labor. A single shepherd, using dogs, could manage several hundred Cheviots across open hill ground that would once have supported a dozen tenant families raising cattle and growing oats. Wool prices in this period were strong, driven by the expanding textile mills of Yorkshire and the west of Scotland, and mutton found a ready market in the growing industrial towns of the lowlands. For a landowner now thinking in terms of annual return per acre, the arithmetic was direct and, from a purely commercial standpoint, difficult to argue with. A given stretch of glen, cleared of tenant farms and converted to a single large sheep run under one shepherd, could generate several times the rental income that the same land produced when subdivided among dozens of subsistence tenant families, paying small rents in cash or kind. Estate records from this period, where they survive, show sheep farms let for rents that could run 4, 5, sometimes 6 times higher per acre than the rents previously paid by the tenant townships they replaced. One of the earliest large-scale demonstrations of this arithmetic took place on the Argyll estates in the 1760s, when Sir James Colquhoun and several neighboring landowners began letting extensive hill grazing directly to sheep farmers from the Scottish borders, men who arrived with capital, experience, and, crucially, no ties whatsoever to the tenants already living on the land in question. These border sheep farmers became known across the Highlands, not always affectionately, as the vanguard of a trade that treated land purely as an input to a wool and mutton business, indifferent to whoever had farmed it before. The Earl of Breadalbane's vast estate, straddling Perthshire and Argyll, followed a similar path through the 1770s and 1780s, converting large sections of Glen Lyon and the surrounding hill country to sheep pasture under a series of leases negotiated directly with border graziers, while existing tenant townships in the same glens received notice that their own leases would not be renewed on the old terms. Breadalbane's factors kept detailed rent ledgers comparing the old tenant income against the new sheep farm income for the same ground, ledgers that survive in the estate's archive and that show, parcel by parcel, exactly the kind of arithmetic driving decisions across the Highlands during this period. By the 1770s, sheep farms of several thousand acres had been established in Argyll, Perthshire, and parts of Inverness-shire, and the rents they commanded were being discussed openly in Edinburgh commercial circles as proof that the Highlands, properly managed, could be made as profitable as any lowland estate. Wool exports from Scotland as a whole rose sharply through the final decades of the 18th century, and contemporary trade records show the price of Highland wool nearly doubling between the 1760s and the 1790s, a trend that made every additional acre converted from tenant farming to sheep pasture more valuable with each passing year. A single Cheviot sheep required, by most contemporary estimates, somewhere between 2 and 5 acres of hill pasture, depending on the quality of the ground, meaning that a sheep farm covering 10,000 acres, a size not unusual by the 1780s, could support a flock in the thousands under the management of a handful of shepherds and their dogs. The demand pulling this wool southward was itself changing shape during these same decades, as mechanized spinning and weaving, developed first in England through inventions such as Richard Arkwright's water-powered spinning frame in the 1760s, began transforming the British textile industry from a network of small household producers into a system of large mills capable of processing far greater quantities of raw wool than earlier generations of weavers ever could. Highland wool, previously a modest regional product, found itself pulled directly into this expanding industrial supply chain, and the total sheep population of the Highlands and Islands is estimated to have grown from a comparatively small base in the 1760s to well over 2 million animals by the early decades of the 19th century. The second development was, for a period of several decades, almost as significant, though it worked in the opposite direction, at least at first. This was the kelp industry. Kelp is the ash produced by burning certain species of seaweed, and in the second half of the 18th century it became a valuable industrial raw material, used in the manufacture of glass, soap, and, most importantly, given the wars Britain fought during this period, gunpowder and various chemical processes tied to the war economy. Producing kelp required large amounts of manual labor, cutting, drying, and burning seaweed along the shoreline, but very little land and coastal estates in the Hebrides and the Western Highlands found in kelp production a source of income that did not depend on converting arable land to pasture at all. For a time, this created a genuine tension in estate planning, because kelp production actually required a landowner to keep people on the land, densely settled along the coast, rather than clear them off it. The MacDonald estate on the island of North Uist and the MacLeod estate on Skye Both developed substantial kelp operations through the 1770s and 1780s, and surviving rental records from these estates show kelp income in some years exceeding the total rent collected from all agricultural tenancies combined. On the Clanranald estate, covering large portions of South Uist and the smaller islands nearby, kelp income by the 1790s regularly exceeded £4,000 a year, a sum that dwarfed anything the same land had produced under traditional tenant farming, and that gave the estate's owners a direct financial incentive to keep as many hands as possible working the shore each summer. This incentive cut directly against the logic driving sheep conversion in the interior, and for several decades, the two industries coexisted uneasily on the same estates, sheep pushing tenants toward the coast, kelp pulling them in and holding them there. Some estates, particularly in the Outer Hebrides, pursued a strategy in these decades that combined both approaches, clearing the interior glens for sheep while deliberately retaining, and in some cases even increasing, the coastal population to supply labor for kelp burning. This distinction matters because it explains why the clearances did not happen everywhere in the same way or on the same timeline. Where an estate's coastline offered good kelp-producing shores, landlords often relocated evicted interior tenants to newly created coastal settlements, rather than pushing them off the estate entirely. This was not leniency, but calculation. Those same tenants represented a cheap and necessary labor supply for a separate, profitable enterprise. This pattern of relocation to the coast would become one of the defining features of the clearances as they intensified in the following decades, and it explains the origin of the small, crowded crofting townships that still line much of the Highland and Hebridean coastline today. A crofter was not a peasant farmer in the traditional Highland sense. He was typically an agricultural tenant whose landholding had been deliberately reduced to a size too small to support a family through farming alone, on the calculation, often made explicit in estate correspondence of the period, that the shortfall would be made up through kelp labor, fishing, or seasonal work elsewhere. The system depended on Highland landowners' continued access to a captive coastal labor force, and it depended on kelp prices remaining high enough to make that labor force worth retaining. Both of these conditions would later collapse, but that collapse belongs to a later stage of this account. Population growth added a further pressure that made the old subsistence system harder to sustain on its own terms, independent of anything a landowner chose to do. The population of the Highlands and Islands grew substantially across the 18th century, following broader trends across Scotland and much of Europe, and in a region where arable land was already scarce and mostly claimed, that growth meant existing tenant holdings were repeatedly subdivided among sons and grandsons. Each subdivision produced smaller and smaller plots, less and less able to support a family even under the old subsistence pattern. The traditional run-rig system, under which a township's arable land was divided into strips reallocated periodically among tenant families, had been designed for a stable or slowly growing population. It coped poorly with the sustained growth of the second half of the 18th century, and by the 1780s, many interior glens supported tenant populations at densities that left little margin for a bad harvest. Contemporary observers, writing in the parish reports collected for Sinclair's survey, frequently noted holdings that had once supported a single family, now divided among 3 or 4, each with a smaller share of arable ground and a correspondingly smaller reserve against a failed crop or a hard winter. This subdivision was not, in most cases, imposed by a landlord. It arose from within the tenant community itself, from a father's wish to provide some land for each of his sons, rather than see younger children leave with nothing, a customary practice that had functioned reasonably well when population growth was slow, and that became increasingly unsustainable as growth accelerated. Estate factors, the administrators managing these properties on behalf of chiefs who increasingly lived in Edinburgh, London, or on the European continent, were well aware that the arithmetic of subdivided subsistence farming could not compete with the arithmetic of a consolidated sheep run. Parish ministers across the Highlands were, at almost the same moment, compiling detailed local reports for what became known as the first statistical account of Scotland, a nationwide survey organized by Sir John Sinclair between 1791 and 1799 that asked every parish minister in the country to describe, among other things, the state of agriculture, population, and rents in his own parish. Many of these ministers recorded, in their own words, the early stages of exactly the transformation this account is describing: rising rents, the arrival of sheep farmers from the south, and tenant families departing for the coast or for North America, often within the space of a single decade covered by their report. A minister writing from a parish in Sutherland in the mid-1790s described a population that had grown steadily for 2 generations, now facing rents that had, in his own recollection, more than doubled within the span of his own ministry, a pattern echoed in similar reports from ministers across Ross-shire, Inverness-shire, and Argyll. Rent increases became the first and most common instrument of change, well before mass eviction became standard practice on most estates. Rather than evicting tenants outright, many estates in this period simply raised rents on renewal, sometimes sharply, forcing tenants either to find additional income through kelp labor, fishing, or seasonal migrant work in the lowlands, or to fall behind and accumulate arrears that could later justify removal on straightforward commercial grounds. This slower, rent-driven pressure produced a first wave of departures that was less dramatic than the mass evictions to come, but no less real. A pattern typical of many Highland tenant households in this period can be reconstructed from the surviving rent rolls and parish records of the 1780s, even where no single family's full story survives intact. A tenant farming a small holding in the interior of Inverness-shire or Ross-shire might see his rent rise gradually across a decade, from a sum his family had paid for a generation to one nearly double that amount by the time his eldest son came of age. Faced with a choice between splitting an already inadequate holding between 2 sons, or seeing one son leave to seek a tenancy, a trade, or passage abroad, many families chose the latter, not because they wished to leave the glen their ancestors had farmed, but because the arithmetic of the holding itself no longer allowed for both sons to stay. Younger sons found themselves unable to obtain a tenancy of their own, and entire families chose emigration to North America over accepting a smaller and smaller share of increasingly expensive land. Tacksmen, where they still held any authority at all, organized group emigrations that sometimes carried dozens of families to Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, or the Carolinas in a single voyage, following the pattern already set by the Hector and by Glenaladale's settlement a few years earlier. Scottish emigration to British North America in the 1770s reached levels significant enough to alarm some in the government, who worried about losing a population still viewed, even after Culloden, as a valuable source of soldiers for the British Army. Highland regiments recruited heavily and effectively throughout the second half of the 18th century, an irony of the period worth noting directly, given that the same government had spent 1746 and 1747 dismantling the clan structure that had once produced those soldiers. Parliament went so far as to debate legislation restricting emigration from the Highlands in the mid-1770s, motivated in large part by concerns over the future supply of military recruits. Though the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775 disrupted transatlantic shipping enough to reduce emigration sharply for the remainder of that decade, regardless of any legislative action. The government's position through these debates was, in practice, contradictory, and it would remain contradictory for the rest of the clearance period. Ministers in London wanted a Highland population large enough and loyal enough to keep filling the ranks of Highland regiments in Britain's ongoing wars, while at the same time declining to place any meaningful restriction on landowners' right to raise rents or reclaim land for sheep, the very policies driving that same population toward emigrant ships. No Act of Parliament in this period ever resolved that contradiction in the tenants' favor, and none would for exactly a century to come. Emigration resumed and expanded once the war ended in 1783, driven by the same rent pressures that had produced it before the conflict, now compounded by nearly a decade of further rent increases across most Highland estates. By the late 1780s, the economic case for full-scale conversion of interior glens to sheep pasture was well established on paper, tested successfully on a growing number of estates, and increasingly discussed openly among landowners and their factors as simply good estate management. Agricultural writers of the period, including figures associated with the Board of Agriculture established in 1793 under Sir John Sinclair, actively promoted large-scale sheep farming as the rational, modern alternative to what they characterized in their own publications as the backward, inefficient farming methods of the traditional Highland township. This framing of clearance as agricultural progress rather than dispossession did not originate with any single estate. It circulated through pamphlets, agricultural societies, and correspondence among landowners across Scotland, giving individual factors and chiefs a ready-made vocabulary to describe what they were doing in terms that sounded like improvement rather than removal. The legal mechanism that made removal possible rested on the specific terms under which most Highland tenants held their land, and those terms had shifted quietly over the same decades as the rest of the economy. Many tenant families in the mid-18th century had held their farms informally, from year to year, on the strength of custom and a chief's ongoing goodwill, rather than any written lease, an arrangement that offered no legal protection at all, once that goodwill was replaced by commercial calculation. Where written leases did exist, they typically ran for 19 years, a standard term across much of lowland Scotland as well. And as these leases expired through the 1770s and 1780s, estates increasingly declined to renew them on the old terms, offering instead either a sharply higher rent or no renewal whatsoever. Some tenant communities responded to rising rents and non-renewal, not with departure but with petition, sending letters or delegations to a chief or landowner, often invoking generations of service and kinship in an appeal to obligations the old clan system had once guaranteed, but the law no longer enforced. Surviving correspondence from several Highland estates in the 1780s includes replies to such petitions, uniformly polite in tone and uniformly unmoved in substance, citing the estate's financial position and the available alternative of a higher-paying tenant as sufficient justification for the decision already made. This pattern, appeal followed by polite refusal, repeated itself across estate after estate through the final 2 decades of the 18th century, and it left many tenant communities with a clear, if bitter, understanding that the old bonds of loyalty their families had once relied upon carried no weight whatsoever against a rent roll. What remained by the final years of the 1780s was the practical problem of removal itself. How could a factor clear a glen that had been continuously inhabited for centuries quickly enough to let a new sheep tenant take up his lease on schedule? And how could this be done without triggering the kind of organized resistance that a suddenly dispossessed population with nothing left to lose might be capable of mounting? The polite refusals recorded in estate correspondence through the 1780s suggest that landowners themselves anticipated no serious resistance at all, expecting their tenants to accept removal with the same quiet resignation that had met every rent increase before it. That expectation would be tested directly and answered with force in the early 1790s in Ross-shire, in an episode that produced the first organized, armed resistance to clearance anywhere in the Highlands. In July of 1792, several hundred men moved through the glens of Ross-shire, driving sheep before them, not their own sheep, but the flocks that had recently replaced tenant farms across the district. Their goal was direct, and for a brief and unusual stretch of days, effective. They intended to drive every sheep they could find south, out of Ross-shire entirely, on the theory that removing the flocks would make the new pastoral economy physically impossible to operate. Contemporary accounts describe close to 6,000 sheep gathered and moved during the action, which became known afterward in Gaelic as Bleedna nan Carach, the year of the sheep. This episode did not emerge without warning. By 1792, sheep farms had already been established across substantial portions of Ross-shire, following the same commercial logic already visible elsewhere in the Highlands, Cheviot flocks under a single shepherd generating rents that no subdivided tenant township could match. Landowners, including Sir Hector Munro of Novar, had begun converting extensive tracts of formerly tenanted land to sheep pasture through the 1780s, displacing tenant families who had in many cases farmed the same ground for generations under their own family names. Munro's own estate correspondence from this period, later cited in accounts of the uprising, shows him corresponding directly with sheep farmers from the borders about lease terms for ground his tenants had not yet been formally removed from, suggesting that at least some Ross-shire clearances proceeded on the assumption that removal was merely a formality still to be arranged. Similar arrangements were underway on neighboring estates belonging to the Mackenzies of Seaforth and to several smaller Ross-shire landowners, all pursuing the same commercial logic within a few years of one another, so that by 1792, the entire county had a growing population of newly arrived border sheep farmers, holding leases on land whose previous tenants had, in many cases, not yet fully vacated it. This concentration of grievance within a single county, rather than spread thinly across the whole Highlands, helps explain why Ross-shire in particular produced the level of organized response that followed. in a way that the slower, more scattered clearances underway elsewhere in the same decade did not. Displacement in this period rarely meant a single dramatic event. It typically meant a tenant receiving notice that his lease would not be renewed at its next term, followed by a period, sometimes lasting a year or more, in which the tenant either found alternative land, increasingly scarce as more estates converted to sheep, or was formally removed by the local sheriff officer, with his possessions set outside the house. In some documented cases, the roof itself was dismantled to prevent reoccupation. By the early summer of 1792, this slower process had already displaced enough families across Ross-shire that resentment had accumulated across several parishes simultaneously, rather than being confined to any single glen. The organizers of the drive were, by most surviving accounts, ordinary tenant farmers, rather than any organized political movement, acting without support from clergy, from the tacksman class, or from any authority beyond their own communities. They moved through the district gathering sheep from farms that had displaced their neighbors, intending to push the animals across the county boundary into Inverness-shire, on the theory, mistaken as it turned out, that sheep removed from Ross-shire could not simply be driven back. For roughly a week, the action succeeded in its immediate aim. Sheep farmers found their flocks gone, scattered, or moving south under armed escort, and no local magistrate possessed the manpower to intervene directly. The response, when it came from Edinburgh rather than from within Ross-shire itself. The Lord Advocate of Scotland, Robert Dundas, dispatched a detachment of the Black Watch Regiment, which reached the district within days and moved to disperse the drovers and recover the scattered flocks. The government's response reflected a calculation that had little to do with the specific value of the sheep involved, and everything to do with precedent. A successful, sustained act of collective resistance to clearance, if left unpunished, risked encouraging similar action across every county in the Highlands where sheep farming was expanding. Several of the organizers were arrested in the weeks following the dispersal, and the most prominent among them, a tenant farmer identified in surviving court papers as William Chisholm, was brought before the circuit court along with a handful of others on charges connected to the disturbance. The most severe sentences proposed against the accused, including transportation, the forced relocation of convicted offenders to overseas penal colonies, were, in most cases, either reduced or not fully carried out. Court records from the subsequent circuit sitting at Inverness show that of several men originally charged, most were released after a period of imprisonment awaiting trial, with only a small number receiving any further sentence, and none of those sentences approaching the severity the Lord Advocate had initially sought. This leniency reflected, in part, the practical difficulty of proving individual responsibility within a crowd of several hundred participants, and in part a concern, expressed in some official correspondence of the period, that harsh punishment might generate more sympathy for the drovers' cause than the original evictions had. The year of the sheep produced no lasting change in the trajectory of Highland land use. Sheep farming continued to expand across Ross-shire in the years that followed, and the tenant families whose displacement had triggered the uprising did not, in the vast majority of cases, recover the land they had lost. What the episode demonstrated, clearly and for the first time, was the limit of what organized resistance could achieve against an opponent who controlled both the legal system and, when necessary, the machinery of the British Army. No later clearance in the Highlands produced resistance on a comparable scale, and this is not a coincidence. Landowners and their factors drew a direct lesson from 1792 that removals conducted individually, farm by farm, over an extended period, generated far less risk of coordinated resistance than removals attempted all at once across an entire district. The eviction procedure that developed in the decades following 1792, and that would reach its most extensively documented form in Sutherland roughly 2 decades later, followed a consistent pattern across most Highland estates. An estate factor, typically a professional land manager, often trained in the newer commercial farming methods being developed in the Scottish lowlands, and frequently someone with no personal or family connection to the tenants under his management, would identify a glen or township for clearance. This identification usually occurred because a prospective sheep farmer, often from the Scottish borders where large-scale sheep farming was already well established, had offered a rent the factor judged the land could sustain under pasture. Tenants in the identified area would receive formal notice, frequently delivered by a sheriff officer, specifying a date by which they were required to vacate. The interval between notice and enforced removal varied considerably by estate and by period, ranging from several months to, in some documented cases, no more than a matter of weeks. Where tenants did not vacate voluntarily by the specified date, factors employed teams of estate workers, sometimes assisted by sheriff officers, and, in the largest operations, by hired laborers brought in specifically for the purpose, to carry out physical eviction. This process is documented in surviving estate correspondence, in contemporary newspaper accounts, and in testimony later collected before government inquiry, and it followed a broadly consistent sequence. Furniture and possessions were removed from the house, the household was ordered out, and the roof timbers were either pulled down or set alight, a practice intended specifically to prevent the family from simply moving back in once the eviction party had departed. The burning of roof timbers has become, in later popular memory, the single most associated image of the Highland clearances, and it is documented in enough independent sources across enough different estates to establish it as standard practice rather than isolated cruelty. A description consistent with many separately documented evictions of this period can be reconstructed from the surviving accounts, even where no single record captures every detail of any one specific day. A factor and a small party of estate workers, sometimes 6 or 8 men, would arrive at a township in the early morning, before tenants had time to organize any collective response. Furniture, tools, and stores of meal or grain were carried out of each house in turn and set on the ground outside, while the household itself, often including elderly residents and infants, was told to gather what it could carry and leave. Once a house stood empty, workers pulled the thatch and timber roof down, or in a smaller number of cases set it alight directly, and moved on to the next house in the township before the light faded. By evening, a settlement that had stood for generations could be reduced to a row of roofless stone walls, and the families who had lived there were left to find shelter with neighbors, in the open or on the road toward the coast, wherever the estate had designated as their new holding. The practical logic behind it was straightforward from the estate's perspective. A family with an intact house, even one legally ordered to leave, might simply wait for the eviction party to depart and then move back in, particularly in a region with no alternative housing readily available. and a burned or dismantled roof removed that option entirely. Estates conducting evictions on this pattern were not, in most cases, acting in violation of the law as it stood in this period. Scottish law recognized the landowner's right to remove a tenant at the end of a lease term and the physical destruction of a vacated tenant's dwelling, while it generated significant moral controversy even among contemporaries, was not itself a criminal act under the property law of the period, so long as the tenant had genuinely been given legal notice and the specified date for removal had passed. This distinction between what was legally permitted and what was, by the standards of many contemporary observers, including some within the Church of Scotland and some members of the landowning class itself, morally indefensible, runs through the entire history of the clearances. A small number of tenants did attempt to challenge evictions directly through the Scottish courts in this period, arguing customary rights of occupancy that predated any written lease. But such cases rarely succeeded, since Scottish property law recognized written title and formal lease terms far more readily than it recognized generations of unwritten custom. One such case, brought by a group of tenants on a Perthshire estate in the early 1800s, was dismissed by the Court of Session on the grounds that no documentary evidence of a permanent right to the land existed, regardless of how many generations the family had actually farmed it. Rulings of this kind reinforced, at the highest judicial level in Scotland, the same basic imbalance already visible in every eviction described so far, an imbalance in which written paper consistently outweighed lived history. It explains why so few factors or landowners ever faced successful legal consequences for even the most severe documented evictions. The Church of Scotland's position on the clearances was neither unified nor consistent, and it varied considerably from parish to parish and minister to minister. Some ministers, dependent on the landowner for their own living and appointed in many parishes directly by the local laird under a system known as patronage, preached sermons urging tenants to accept removal with patience and Christian resignation, framing hardship as a trial to be endured rather than a wrong to be resisted. Other ministers, particularly within the evangelical wing of the church that would eventually split away to form the Free Church of Scotland in 1843, spoke out directly against specific evictions, and a small number provided food, shelter, or written testimony on behalf of tenants facing removal. This division within the church mirrored a broader division in Highland and Lowland opinion generally, between those who accepted the estate's framing of clearance as necessary improvement and those who regarded the same events as an abuse of power dressed in the language of progress. Argyll provides one of the clearer regional examples of how this pattern developed through the final years of the 18th century and the opening years of the 19th. Estates across Argyll, including significant portions of land controlled by the Duke of Argyll and by smaller landowning families throughout the county, converted extensive acreage to sheep pasture during this period, and tenant displacement proceeded largely through the rent increase and non-renewal method rather than through the more abrupt mass evictions that would later characterize Sutherland. This slower method produced a steady outflow of emigration from Argyll through the 1790s and into the first decade of the 1800s, with substantial numbers of displaced tenants departing for Glasgow and other expanding lowland industrial centres, and smaller but still significant numbers emigrating directly to British North America. Shipping records from the port of Greenock, the principal point of departure for many Argyll and Western Highland emigrants, show a marked increase in Highland passenger numbers through the 1790s, rising further still after 1801, when a series of poor harvests across parts of the Western Highlands added fresh urgency to families already weighing the decision to leave. Glasgow itself absorbed a significant share of this displaced population, and by the early 19th century, Highland migrants and their children formed a distinct and growing community within the city, working increasingly in the cotton mills and shipyards that were transforming Glasgow into one of Britain's largest industrial centers. This urban destination, less remembered today than the transatlantic emigrant ships, represented one of the two major channels through which displaced Highland tenants entered the wider British economy, the other being emigration overseas, and both channels drew from the same underlying cause. A second and more abrupt episode occurred on the Glengarry estate in Inverness-shire, where Alexander Ranaldson MacDonald, chief of Glengarry, cleared substantial portions of his own clan lands for sheep in the early 1800s, an action noted by contemporaries as especially striking given MacDonald's public reputation as a self-styled defender of traditional Highland customs and dress. MacDonald's own tenants, faced with eviction from a chief who publicly presented himself as the last true upholder of the old clan order, found the contradiction bitter enough that it was remarked upon directly in at least one surviving contemporary account, which observed that the chief who dressed most elaborately in the tartan, now banned for others, seemed to feel no obligation at all toward the people whose ancestors had worn it into battle for his own family. MacDonald's clearances on his own estate continued intermittently for 2 more decades, and by the 1820s, a substantial portion of Glengarry's tenants had emigrated, many organizing their own passage to Glengarry County in Upper Canada, a settlement named in direct memory of the glen its founders had been forced to leave. The pattern in Glengarry illustrates a detail that recurs across many individual clearances of this period. Displaced tenants frequently carried the name of their lost home directly into the landscape of their new one, a practice that produced dozens of Highland place names scattered across Nova Scotia, Ontario, Prince Edward Island, and later Australia and New Zealand, each one marking the point where a specific community had been forced to begin again. A further and less publicized round of clearance took place on the Glenelg estate on the mainland coast opposite Skye, where tenant townships in Glenbeig and the surrounding hills were cleared for sheep in stages between the 1790s and the 1810s, with displaced families relocated in some cases to smaller coastal holdings and in others directed toward emigrant vessels departing from the nearby port of Ilornse. Surviving Glenelg estate correspondence from this period records factors discussing removal timing specifically around the sailing schedule of emigrant ships, coordinating eviction dates so that displaced tenants would arrive at the coast with as little delay and as little opportunity to seek alternative local arrangements as possible. This coordination between eviction and emigration scheduling would become increasingly common on Highland estates through the early decades of the 19th century, reflecting a growing recognition among factors that emigration, rather than simple relocation within the estate, offered the most permanent solution to the problem of a displaced tenant population that might otherwise drift back toward its original holdings. The distinction between the Argyll pattern and what would follow in Sutherland was not one of underlying economic logic. Both estates were responding to the same fundamental calculation that sheep pasture generated more rental income than subdivided tenant farming. But the two approaches differed sharply in pace and method, and that difference in method would determine how each region was remembered. Where clearance proceeded gradually, through rent pressure and non-renewal over a period of years, it left behind comparatively little documentary record of the kind that could later be assembled into a single, damning narrative. Where clearance proceeded rapidly, through mass eviction orders affecting entire glens within a period of months, it generated exactly that kind of record: eyewitness accounts, newspaper coverage, and eventually legal proceedings, because the scale and speed of the operation made it impossible to conduct quietly. Almost every landowner engaged in clearance through the 1790s and early 1800s understood this distinction, whether or not they ever stated it directly in surviving correspondence, and most, following the lesson of Rothschild, continued to favor the gradual method precisely because it left so little trace. One family, however, would abandon that caution entirely, choosing speed and scale over discretion, in the belief that their own wealth and standing placed them beyond the kind of scrutiny gradual clearance had been designed to avoid. Sutherland, in the second decade of the 19th century, would become the second kind of clearance, carried out under the direction of a landowning family with more capital, more ambition, and more confidence in the moral correctness of their own economic project than almost any other estate in the Highlands. Elizabeth Gordon became Countess of Sutherland in 1766, at the age of 1, following the death of her father, and she inherited with the title one of the largest land holdings in Europe, close to 1.5 million acres across the county of Sutherland, in the far north of the Scottish mainland. In 1785, she married George Granville Levison Gower, an English aristocrat who would later become Marquess of Stafford, and, in 1833, the first Duke of Sutherland, and who brought to the marriage a personal fortune substantial enough to make the combined Sutherland estate one of the wealthiest private landholdings in the United Kingdom. Levison Gower's fortune derived in large part from canal investments and coal interests in England, holdings entirely separate from Highland land, and this outside wealth gave the Sutherland estate something almost no other Highland landowner possessed: sufficient capital to fund clearance and resettlement as a single coordinated, large-scale project. A significant portion of that fortune traced back to his uncle, Francis Egerton, the third Duke of Bridgewater, whose investment in Britain's first major canal, connecting his Lancashire coal mines to Manchester, had made him one of the wealthiest men in England, and had earned him the popular title of the Canal Duke. Levison Gower inherited this canal and coal fortune in 1803, several years before the Sutherland Clearances began in earnest, and it is difficult to overstate how directly this unrelated English industrial wealth shaped what followed in the Scottish Highlands. Most other estates were forced to proceed slowly through the rent increase and non-renewal method already described, precisely because they lacked the capital to compensate, resettle, or otherwise manage a sudden mass removal. The Sutherland family did not regard themselves as simply extracting more rent from existing land use. Correspondence and estate planning documents from this period show a stated intention to fundamentally reorganize the entire economy of the county, clearing the interior straths for large-scale sheep farming, while relocating the displaced tenant population to newly created coastal townships. There, tenants were expected to support themselves through fishing and small-scale crofting, supplemented by wage labor in planned industries including, at various points, salt panning, brick manufacturing, and textile production. This plan required 2 men to execute it on the ground, and both would become, in the years that followed, the most closely identified individuals in the entire history of the Highland Clearances. William Young was appointed as the estate's commissioner in 1809, brought north from Morayshire specifically to oversee the reorganization of the Sutherland estate along the lines the family had planned. Young had built his reputation managing agricultural improvement on lowland estates, and the Sutherland family valued him specifically for experience in exactly the kind of large-scale reorganization they intended to carry out. Young's correspondence with the Sutherland family during his recruitment describes the northern estate as an opportunity to apply lowland farming principles on a scale no single lowland estate could offer, language that reveals how consciously the family and its chosen managers understood Sutherland as an experiment in applied improvement theory rather than simply an unusually large eviction program. Patrick Sellar, a lawyer by training and a graduate of Edinburgh University, was appointed factor under Young in 1810 and took on direct responsibility for implementing evictions across substantial portions of the estate. Sellar also personally leased large sheep farms carved out of the very land he was clearing, an arrangement that placed him in the position of directly profiting from the removals he was administering, a conflict of interest that would later feature prominently in the controversy surrounding his conduct. Sellar's own surviving letters from this period describe the tenant population in terms drawn directly from the improvement vocabulary that had circulated through Highland estate management since the 1780s, characterizing existing farming methods as backward and expressing confidence that removal would ultimately benefit the very families being displaced by exposing them to a more modern, commercial way of life. Sellar himself leased the sheep farm of Culmailey, and later a substantially larger holding covering much of the ground cleared in Strathnaver, at rents that estate records show returning many times the income the same land had generated under tenant farming, placing him among the direct financial beneficiaries of the very policy he had been hired to administer. The first major phase of clearance under this new management began in the district of Kildonan in 1813, when notice was given to tenant families across the Strath that their holdings would be required for sheep pasture, with resettlement offered on newly allotted coastal plots. Roughly 90 families received eviction notices in Kildonan that year, and surviving parish records suggest the total population directly affected, counting all members of each household, numbered well over 400 people from this single district alone. Resistance in Kildonan was significant enough that Sellar and Young requested military support, and a detachment of soldiers was dispatched to the district. The confrontation that followed did not escalate into the kind of sustained armed action seen in Ross-shire 2 decades earlier. Contemporary accounts describe a tense standoff at one Kildonan township in which a group of tenants, mostly women according to the surviving description, physically blocked the road to prevent the eviction party from reaching the houses, holding their position for the better part of a day before the arrival of additional soldiers ended the standoff without serious violence. The Kildonan tenants, faced with an organized removal backed by the threat of military force, largely complied, though not without documented protest, and at least one recorded instance of tenants confronting Sellar directly over the terms being offered. Some Kildonan families chose emigration over relocation to the coast, and a group from the district sailed for Canada that same year, eventually settling in a district of Ontario that its founders named Kildonan, in memory of the strath they had left, a naming pattern already familiar from Glengarry and other cleared estates. The clearance that followed in Strathnaver in 1814 became the single most extensively documented episode in the entire history of the Highland Clearances, largely because of the survival of detailed eyewitness testimony from a man named Donald MacLeod, a local stonemason, who later published a written account of what he had witnessed. MacLeod's account, eventually published in a series of newspaper letters and later collected into a pamphlet titled Gloomy Memories, provided a level of specific, dated, named detail that no other clearance in this period produced, and it remains the primary source for most of what is known about the events of that summer. MacLeod himself was later evicted from his own holding in Sutherland after his public criticism of the estate became known, and he eventually emigrated to Canada, where he continued writing and publishing his account of the clearances until his death, never returning to the county where the events he described had taken place. His writing reached a wider British public than any previous account of a Highland eviction, appearing in Edinburgh and London newspapers and prompting exchanges of letters between defenders of the Sutherland estate and sympathizers with the evicted tenants that continued in the press for years after the events themselves. Eviction notices went out across Strathnaver in the spring of 1814, and the physical removals took place primarily in June of that year. MacLeod's account, along with testimony later given by other Strathnaver residents, describes eviction parties burning houses in some cases while elderly or infirm occupants were still inside or in the immediate vicinity. It describes at least one specific case, that of an elderly woman named Margaret Mackay, sometimes recorded as Chisholm, who was reportedly injured when the roof of her house was set alight before she had been fully removed from the building. MacLeod's account states that the woman survived the immediate injury but died within days, and that Sellar, when informed of her condition, dismissed concerns about her welfare in terms MacLeod recorded as callous rather than apologetic. The scale of destruction in Strathnaver that summer led the district to be remembered in Gaelic oral tradition as Bleedna and Losgaid, the year of the burnings. These events produced the only significant criminal prosecution to emerge from the entire Highland Clearances. Patrick Sellar was indicted in 1816 on charges that included culpable homicide, arson, and other offenses connected to the Strathnaver evictions, with the case brought before the Circuit Court of Justiciary at Inverness in April of that year, presided over by Lord Pitmilly. The trial drew significant public attention, both within Scotland and, to a lesser extent, in the wider British press, and it turned substantially on questions of intent and direct responsibility. The central legal question was whether Sellar himself had ordered or personally participated in specific acts of destruction, or whether he bore responsibility only in the broader administrative sense as the factor who had authorized the overall clearance. The prosecution called a number of Strathnaver residents as witnesses, whose testimony described the events of the eviction in terms broadly consistent with MacLeod's later published account, while the defense argued that any harm caused had been unintentional, incidental to a lawful eviction, rather than the product of deliberate cruelty. After a trial lasting a single day, the jury acquitted Sellar on all charges. The courtroom, according to press accounts published in the days following, was crowded well beyond its ordinary capacity, with observers traveling from as far as Edinburgh to witness proceedings that were, by that point, already being discussed across Scotland as a test of whether a Highland factor could ever be held criminally accountable for conduct carried out in the course of an otherwise lawful eviction. Estate defenders at the time and since have pointed to this verdict as evidence that the more severe accusations against him were exaggerated or fabricated by hostile witnesses. Critics have pointed to the same verdict, with equal consistency, as evidence of how difficult it was, structurally, for a Highland tenant to secure a conviction against a factor acting with the backing of a powerful landowning family, and a legal system administered largely by men of the same social class as the accused. Sellar resigned his position as factor shortly after the trial, though he continued to lease and profit from sheep farms on the Sutherland estate for years afterward, including, notably, farms carved directly out of the Strathnaver land he had been accused of clearing by force. The ruined settlement of Rosal, in Strathnaver, cleared during this same period, survives today as an archaeological site managed by the Forestry Commission, its foundations and field boundaries still visible on the ground, one of the most physically intact reminders of the clearance anywhere in the Highlands. William Young left his position as commissioner around the same period, and the Sutherland Estates clearance program continued under new management through the remainder of the 1810s and into the 1820s, following the same essential model: interior straths cleared for sheep, displaced populations relocated to coastal townships. The estate appointed Francis Suther as factor for the northern portion of Sutherland in the years following Sellar's resignation, and clearances continued under his management through the 1820s in districts including Assynt on the northwest coast, where tenant townships were cleared in stages and resettled along a coastline already crowded with families displaced from earlier phases of the program. Assynt's own cleared population would, more than a century and a half later, become directly relevant to the modern land reform movement described toward the end of this account, when their descendants organized one of the first successful community land buyouts anywhere in the Highlands. The scale of this program, taken as a whole, is difficult to overstate. Estimates drawn from surviving estate records suggest that somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000 people were removed from their inland holdings across Sutherland during the main period of clearance, spanning roughly 1807 to 1821, making it, by a considerable margin, the single largest coordinated clearance operation conducted on any Highland estate. The coastal resettlement plan that was supposed to accompany these removals achieved, at best, mixed results. Newly created townships such as Helmsdale and Brora offered plots of land too small to support a family through agriculture alone, on the explicit assumption, stated in estate planning documents, that fishing and wage labor would supply the remaining income. Helmsdale, in particular, grew rapidly as a herring fishing station through the 1820s, with the estate investing directly in harbor construction and curing houses, and for a period during the height of the herring season, the town's population swelled with seasonal workers drawn from across the resettled coastal townships. That assumption depended heavily on the continued strength of herring fishing markets and on planned industrial ventures that did not, in most cases, develop at the scale or with the reliability the estate had projected. Many families relocated to the coast under this plan found themselves without adequate land, without reliable fishing income in years when herring shoals moved elsewhere along the coast, and without the promised industrial employment. Visitors to the Sutherland coast in the 1820s and 1830s, including government officials conducting unrelated surveys, recorded conditions in townships such as Helmsdale that included overcrowded housing, chronic dependence on credit extended by local merchants against future fish catches, and diets reduced, in poorer years, to little more than potatoes and whatever fish a family could catch or trade for. This produced a level of poverty in the new coastal townships that contemporary observers, including some sympathetic to the estate's broader economic goals, described as considerably worse than the subsistence conditions the same families had experienced on their original inland holdings. The Sutherland Countess and her husband defended the entire program, both at the time and in later correspondence, as an act of improvement rather than dispossession, a modernization of what they characterized as a backward agricultural economy that would, in their stated view, ultimately benefit the very population being relocated. This framing of clearance as improvement rather than eviction was not unique to Sutherland, but the scale and documentation of the Sutherland program made it the clearest and most influential articulation of an argument that would be echoed, with variations, by landowners across the Highlands for the remainder of the clearance period. It was also, in the view of critics both contemporary and modern, a framing that conveniently aligned the estate's own commercial interest, the far higher rental value of consolidated sheep farms compared to subdivided tenant holdings, with a claimed concern for the tenants' long-term welfare. Donald MacLeod and other eyewitnesses argued that this convenience was contradicted directly by the poverty they documented in the resettled coastal townships. The Sutherland Clearances, unlike most of the gradual removals described on earlier estates, drew direct comment in the British Parliament, where members occasionally raised the events in Sutherland as an example either of necessary agricultural progress or of landlord excess, depending entirely on the speaker's own political sympathies. No parliamentary inquiry into the Sutherland Clearances specifically was ever launched during this period, and no legislation resulted from the debate, but the exchanges themselves mark one of the first instances in which a Highland estate's internal management became a subject of sustained national political discussion rather than a purely local or regional matter. This shift in visibility, from local grievance to national controversy, would prove significant decades later when a very different generation of crofters sought to draw exactly this kind of national attention to their own struggle against a system that had by then been operating largely unchallenged for most of a century. Long after the main period of clearance had ended, the Sutherland family commissioned a massive stone statue of the first Duke, standing more than 75 feet including its base, on the summit of Beena Braget above Golspie, overlooking much of the county his family had cleared. The statue was completed in 1837, funded by public subscription organized among the Duke's own tenants and estate employees, a fact that later critics would cite as evidence of the enormous social and economic pressure still bearing on any Sutherland resident who might otherwise have declined to contribute. The inscription on the statue's base, composed at the time of its erection, praised the Duke in terms consistent with the improvement framing the estate had used throughout the clearance period, describing him as a friend to the people whose welfare he had labored to advance. The statue has remained a source of controversy in Sutherland into the 21st century, with periodic campaigns calling for its removal or for the addition of a plaque acknowledging the clearances, a debate that continues, in its own way, the same argument between improvement and dispossession that Donald MacLeod and the Sutherland estate conducted in print 2 centuries ago. By the early 1820s, the interior of Sutherland had been substantially cleared of its former tenant population, and the pattern established there, coordinated, large-scale removal followed by coastal resettlement, justified publicly as agricultural improvement, had become the model that other, smaller Highland estates increasingly looked to as their own clearance programs accelerated through the following decades. That acceleration would soon collide with a problem the Sutherland planners had not fully anticipated. The coastal economy that resettlement depended on was itself fragile, resting on industries and markets that could collapse as quickly as they had risen. And when that collapse came, it would strike a population that had already lost the inland land and the subsistence farming skills that might once have offered them another way to survive. The coastal economy that Highland landowners had built to absorb their displaced tenant populations rested on two industries, and by the 1820s, both were beginning to fail at almost the same time. Kelp production, which had made coastal resettlement commercially viable for decades, depended entirely on a wartime economic condition that could not last indefinitely. Through the Napoleonic Wars, which ran with only brief interruption from 1803 to 1815, British trade restrictions and naval blockades had cut off much of continental Europe's supply of barilla, a Spanish plant ash that served the same industrial purposes as Scottish kelp, glassmaking, soap production, and the chemical processes tied to gunpowder manufacture. With barilla unavailable, kelp prices rose sharply, in some periods reaching as much as £20 per ton, and Highland landowners with kelp-producing shoreline found themselves presiding over what amounted to a wartime commodity boom. This boom was the direct economic justification for retaining dense coastal populations that many estates would otherwise have cleared entirely, and it explains why the resettlement plans built into programs like the one carried out in Sutherland made economic sense at the moment they were designed. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 removed the trade barriers that had made Scottish kelp artificially competitive, and Spanish barilla returned to the British market within a few years at a fraction of kelp's wartime price. A further blow came from an unrelated direction in 1822, when Parliament reduced the duty on imported barilla and other alkali substitutes as part of a wider set of tariff reforms, removing what remained of the artificial protection that had allowed Scottish kelp to compete at all against cheaper foreign and synthetic alternatives. Kelp prices collapsed through the late 1810s and into the 1820s, falling from wartime highs of around £20 per ton to as little as £2 or £3 per ton by the early 1830s, a decline of roughly 90% that made the industry unprofitable across nearly every Highland estate that had depended on it. Landowners who had spent 2 decades encouraging population growth along their coastlines, specifically to supply kelp labor, now found themselves holding densely settled shoreline with no remaining commercial purpose for the population living there. The Clanranald estate, whose kelp income had regularly exceeded £4,000 a year at the trade's peak, saw that income fall to a small fraction of its former level within less than a decade, a collapse severe enough to push the estate itself toward the financial difficulties that would, within a generation, force the sale of much of its Hebridean landholding to new owners with far less inherited connection to the tenants living on it. This pattern of debt accumulated during the kelp boom becoming unsustainable once the boom collapsed repeated itself across a number of Hebridean and Western Highland estates through the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, and the resulting wave of estate sales brought a new class of landowner into the Highlands, purchasers with capital but frequently with no family history in the region at all. These new owners, having paid market value for their land, generally arrived with even less inclination toward patience or tradition than the indebted families they replaced, and several of the most severe clearances of the following decades, including events on the island of Lewis and elsewhere in the Hebrides, were carried out not by descendants of the old clan chiefs, but by recently arrived commercial purchasers applying the same improvement logic with none of the older family's residual, if largely theoretical, sense of obligation. This reversal did not immediately produce a second wave of eviction on the scale of Sutherland, in part because many landowners had already committed significant capital to the coastal settlements and were reluctant to abandon that investment outright, and in part because crofting tenants, whatever their poverty, still generated some rental income even without kelp wages behind it. What it did produce was a coastal population living on land holdings that had been deliberately sized, a generation earlier, to be too small for full agricultural self-sufficiency. Small holdings, originally designed on the assumption that kelp wages would supply the difference, now stripped of that supplementary income, with no equivalent replacement. Into this already fragile situation, in the autumn of 1846, arrived a second and more severe crisis, one that would test the entire structure of Highland crofting to its limit. Phytophthora infestans, the potato blight, reached Scotland in 1845 and struck with devastating severity across the Highlands and Islands in 1846, destroying the potato crop on which crofting families, working small holdings too limited to grow a reliable grain surplus, had come to depend as their primary source of calories. The potato had become central to Highland crofting diets, specifically because it produced more food per acre than oats or barley, allowing families to survive on land holdings that had been reduced through decades of subdivision and estate planning to a fraction of the size needed for a traditional grain-based subsistence economy. Agricultural surveys from the early 1840s, conducted shortly before the blight arrived, estimated that in parts of the Hebrides and the Western Highlands, the potato supplied as much as 3/4 of the total calories consumed by crofting households through the winter and spring months. A pattern typical of many crofting households during the famine years can be reconstructed from surviving relief board records, even where no single family's complete story has survived intact. A crofting family holding perhaps 5 or 6 acres in the Western Highlands, already dependent on potatoes for the greater part of its winter food supply, might see that entire crop turn to black rot within days of the blight's arrival, leaving grain reserves too small to fill the gap, and no cash income to purchase meal at market prices that had themselves risen sharply as the crisis spread. Such a family typically applied to the parish relief committee for meal advances, recorded against future labor on relief road projects, or against the family's own rent account, a form of assistance that kept starvation at bay in the great majority of documented cases, but that also, in a great many of the same cases, left the family more deeply in debt to the estate than before the blight had struck. This dependence, which had developed gradually since the late 18th century as croft sizes shrank, meant that when the blight destroyed the crop across successive growing seasons through the late 1840s and into the 1850s, it struck a population with almost no alternative food source and almost no land reserve to fall back on. The blight itself returned in varying severity across multiple growing seasons rather than striking only once, meaning that communities who had exhausted savings credit, and livestock reserves, responding to the first failure in 1846, often had little left to draw on when the crop failed again in subsequent years, a compounding effect that made the Highland famine less a single crisis than a prolonged, grinding period of scarcity stretching across the better part of a decade. The Highland famine that followed is frequently overshadowed, in general historical memory, by the far larger and more severe famine that struck Ireland in the same years. But the underlying cause was the same blight and the structural vulnerability that made it so devastating in the Highlands, traced directly back to decades of land policy that had progressively reduced tenant holdings to sizes dependent on a single crop. Mortality directly attributable to starvation in the Highlands remained comparatively low next to Ireland's famine losses, which are estimated in the range of 1 million deaths, but Highland communities nonetheless experienced sharply elevated rates of disease linked to malnutrition, particularly typhus and dysentery, which spread more readily through populations already weakened by an inadequate diet. This gap between the two famines, similar cause, very different scale of loss, owed much to timing and to the smaller absolute population at risk in the Highlands, but it also owed something to the Free Church of Scotland, formed in the disruption of 1843, when a substantial portion of evangelical ministers broke away from the established Church of Scotland over questions of patronage and independence from landlord influence. Free church ministers, no longer dependent on landowners for their appointment or their living, proved considerably more willing than many of their established church counterparts to organize relief directly within their own famine-stricken parishes, and free church networks played a significant role in channeling donations from lowland Scotland and England into the worst affected Highland districts. The response to the Highland famine differed in important ways from the response in Ireland, largely because Highland landowners and the British government, having watched events unfold in Ireland, moved more quickly to organize relief efforts. This relief included meal distribution funded partly by government loans and partly by charitable subscription through organizations such as the Central Board of Management for Highland Relief, established in Edinburgh in 1847, and drawing donations from across Britain, including a substantial contribution personally subscribed by Queen Victoria. Relief work under this board frequently took the form of what became known as destitution roads and destitution walls, construction projects that paid crofters in meal for labor building roads, drainage systems, and boundary walls across the Highlands, many of which remain in use to the present day, still occasionally identified locally by the famine that funded their construction. The wages paid for this labor were set deliberately low, at a level relief administrators described in their own reports as sufficient to prevent starvation, but insufficient to remove any incentive toward eventual emigration, a policy explicitly intended to use relief works as a bridge toward permanent departure, rather than as a long-term solution to crofting poverty. Some destitution roads led nowhere of any lasting economic value, built primarily to provide labor rather than to serve any genuine transport need, and local memory in parts of the Western Highlands still refers to certain stretches of road by names that translate roughly as the Hungry Road or the Road of the Meal, a linguistic trace of exactly the crisis that produced them. This relief prevented mortality on the scale seen in Ireland, but it did not prevent the famine years from becoming the direct occasion for a new and, in several documented cases, more coercive round of clearance, one carried out under the language of famine relief itself. Some landowners, facing tenants who were both destitute and behind on rent, used the crisis as justification to clear crofts outright, arguing that the land could no longer support its existing population, and that removal, particularly removal through emigration to North America, represented the only realistic solution available to both the estate and the tenants themselves. This argument produced what became known as assisted emigration, a system under which landowners paid, in whole or in part, for the passage of tenant families to Canada or Australia, framed publicly as charitable relief, but functioning, in practical effect, as a mechanism for permanently clearing crofts that had become a financial liability during the famine years. Sir John McNeill, a senior government official who had previously served as a diplomat and physician, was appointed in 1851 to investigate destitution in the Highlands and Islands, and his subsequent report gave qualified official endorsement to assisted emigration as a response to the crisis, a conclusion that critics at the time argued gave landlords a form of government cover for what amounted to continued clearance under a more sympathetic name. The distinction between assisted emigration and forced eviction was, in many documented cases, difficult to draw with confidence, because tenants offered passage were frequently also facing the alternative of eviction without any assistance at all, a choice that left little room for what could honestly be called free consent. The Highland and Island Emigration Society, formed in 1852 under McNeill's continued involvement, coordinated and partly funded the passage of several thousand Highlanders to Australia over the following years, a destination chosen in part because the colony's own authorities were actively seeking agricultural labor and were willing to help cover transport costs that neither destitute tenants nor overstretched estates could otherwise afford in full. Voyages to Australia under this scheme typically lasted 3 to 4 months, considerably longer than the transatlantic crossing to Canada. And while conditions aboard these ships were generally better documented and better regulated than the crossings of the 1770s and 1840s, outbreaks of disease still occurred on a number of voyages, and at least one ship carrying Highland emigrants to Australia in this period recorded a significant number of deaths at sea, mostly among children, before reaching port. Emigrants who survived the journey frequently arrived with little more than the clothing and few possessions they had carried aboard, dependent on colonial authorities or private employers for initial food and shelter until they could establish themselves, a pattern of arrival strikingly similar to that of the Hector's passengers landing at Pictou 8 decades earlier. The island of Skye provides one of the more thoroughly documented examples of this pattern during the famine years, with several estates on the island organizing group emigrations through the late 1840s and into the 1850s that combined elements of both charitable relief and coercive pressure, depending on the specific estate and the specific circumstances of individual families. The estate of Lord MacDonald on Skye entered the famine years already carrying substantial debt, accumulated over decades of maintaining a lifestyle its rental income could no longer support, and the estate's trustees increasingly viewed emigration, whether technically assisted or effectively forced, as a way to reduce the tenant population to a size the debt-burdened estate could still manage. Legal proceedings for rent arrears rose sharply across Skye through the famine years, as tenants who had exhausted their credit with the Parish Relief Committee fell behind on rent that in ordinary years they might have paid from the sale of surplus cattle or grain, sales that famine conditions made impossible. Trustees managing the MacDonald estate's debts calculated, in surviving correspondence, that a smaller tenant population paying reliable rent from crofts newly amalgamated for sheep represented a more sustainable long-term asset than a larger population perpetually behind on payments and dependent on relief, a calculation that led directly to a series of clearances on the estate through the early 1850s. The Knoydart estate on the western mainland produced one of the most severely criticized clearances of the entire famine period, when its owner, Josephine MacDonald, cleared the great majority of her remaining tenants between 1853 and 1854, during the final years of the famine crisis. Contemporary press coverage, including a widely circulated account in the Illustrated London News, described the Knoydart evictions in terms sharply critical of the estate's conduct, even by the standards of a public that had by this point witnessed several decades of similar clearances without sustained outrage. The Knoydart evictions removed a population estimated at roughly 330 people from the estate over this 2-year period, with many transported directly to emigrant ships bound for North America in an operation that estate defenders characterized as a response to unsustainable poverty and famine conditions. Critics characterized the same operation as a continuation of the commercial calculation that had driven clearance from the very beginning. Land emptied of unprofitable tenants was land available for more profitable use, whatever language of relief was used to describe the process. At least one documented account from Knoydart describes families given only days to prepare for permanent removal, gathering what possessions they could carry before being marched to the coast for transport to waiting ships, a level of speed and coercion that drew direct comparison, in press coverage of the time, to the Sutherland Clearances nearly 4 decades earlier. Knoydart's population, which had numbered well over 1,000 people at the start of the 19th century, fell to a small fraction of that figure within the space of a single generation, and much of the estate's interior remained under sheep and later deer forest for the rest of the century, its former townships marked only by ruined walls similar to those still visible today at Rosal in Strathnaver. By the mid-1850s, the combination of kelp collapse, sustained famine conditions, and a second wave of clearance carried out under the cover of emigration assistance had produced a Highland and Hebridean population substantially smaller and substantially more concentrated in crowded coastal crofting townships than it had been at the start of the century. Emigration from the Highlands and Islands across this second wave, from the famine years of the late 1840s through the mid-1850s alone, is estimated by most historians at tens of thousands of people, a figure that, added to the earlier waves already described, brought the cumulative total displacement across the full span of the clearance period into a range that would not become fully clear until the process itself had run its course decades later. What remained by the 1850s was a crofting population that had absorbed nearly every economic shock the preceding century could produce: the loss of the old clan structure, the conversion of interior land to sheep, the collapse of kelp, and a famine that had tested the very survival of communities already reduced to landholdings too small to sustain them. That population had, by this point, also begun to develop something it had rarely possessed during the earlier decades of clearance: a growing awareness, sharpened by decades of loss, that appeals to landlord goodwill and government sympathy had produced almost nothing, and that whatever protection crofting communities were going to obtain, they would very likely have to secure for themselves. On the 15th of April, 1882, a group of crofters on the Braes, a small district on the Isle of Skye south of Portree, confronted a sheriff officer who had arrived to serve eviction notices connected to a long-running dispute over grazing rights on nearby hill pasture. The dispute itself concerned Ben Lee, a hill the Braes crofters had traditionally used for common grazing until the estate withdrew that right several years earlier and let the ground instead to a single large sheep tenant, a familiar pattern by this point in the account, repeated now against a population with far less patience left for it than their grandparents had shown. The crofters seized the officer's eviction papers and burned them in front of him, a direct act of defiance that had almost no precedent in the preceding several decades of Highland land history. 2 days later, a force of approximately 50 police officers, brought in from Glasgow specifically because local Skye authorities could not be relied upon to act against their own neighbors, marched to the Braes to arrest the men identified as responsible for the confrontation. They were met by a crowd of local men and women, estimated in contemporary press accounts at several hundred, who resisted the police with stones and whatever other means were at hand in a clash that left a number of people on both sides injured before the police succeeded in making several arrests. This confrontation, remembered afterward as the Battle of the Braes, was not the largest or most violent episode in the history of Highland land conflict, but it arrived at a moment when its significance extended well beyond Skye itself. It was not, in fact, entirely without precedent, even within recent Highland memory. An earlier and smaller confrontation had taken place in 1874 on the island of Great Bernera in the Outer Hebrides, when crofters resisting the loss of common grazing land to sheep farming clashed with estate officials and police in a dispute that, while less widely reported than the Braes 8 years later, established a similar pattern of direct physical resistance to grazing encroachment that would recur with increasing frequency through the following decade. By 1882, decades of clearance, of assisted emigration, and of crofting poverty had produced a level of organized political awareness among Highland tenants that had not existed during the Sutherland Clearances 70 years earlier. This awareness was sharpened by growing contact with a wider British public, increasingly receptive to arguments about tenant rights, land reform, and the position of small farmers more broadly, arguments already gaining ground through the contemporaneous Irish Land War. The Braes confrontation received extensive coverage in the national British press, in part because of its dramatic nature, and in part because it coincided with a broader political climate in which land reform movements in Ireland were already forcing the British government to confront questions of tenant rights it had, for the most part, avoided addressing in the Highlands. Similar confrontations followed on Skye and on other islands over the next several years, including a notably serious escalation at Glendale on Skye, where a crofter named John Macpherson organized sustained resistance to eviction through 1882 and 1883 that earned him, in later memory, the title of the Glendale Martyr after a period of imprisonment for his role in the unrest. Further disturbances occurred on the island of Lewis, severe enough in some cases that the government deployed naval gunboats and marines to reinforce police action against crofters resisting eviction or rent demands, a level of state force that had not been seen in the Highlands since the aftermath of Culloden itself. This sustained pattern of organized resistance, combined with mounting political pressure from land reform advocates and from a small but increasingly effective number of sympathetic members of Parliament, forced the British government to respond in a way it had never been compelled to respond during the entire preceding century of clearance. Prime Minister William Gladstone's government appointed a royal commission in 1883, chaired by Francis Napier, the 10th Lord Napier, with instructions to investigate the condition of crofters and cotters throughout the Highlands and Islands and to report on potential remedies. The Napier Commission spent the following months traveling across the Highlands and Islands, taking direct testimony from crofters themselves, in their own communities, often in Gaelic through interpreters, producing a documentary record that stands alongside Donald MacLeod's earlier eyewitness account of Strathnaver, among the most extensive first-hand testimony available from the tenant population, directly affected by decades of clearance. Crofters testifying before the commission described in detail that filled thousands of pages of official record, evictions witnessed personally or inherited as family memory, rents they considered unjust, and living conditions on land holdings too small to support their families through any ordinary combination of farming, fishing, and wage labor. One elderly witness on Skye, questioned about conditions on his own holding, described a croft that had been subdivided repeatedly across 3 generations until it could no longer support even a single cow through the winter months, an account the commissioners recorded as broadly representative of testimony they heard across dozens of townships. Witnesses in Sutherland itself, testifying within living memory of some of the events described earlier in this account, recounted stories passed down from parents and grandparents who had lived through the Culloden and Strathnaver clearances, giving the commissioners a direct oral link between the events of 1813 and 1814 and the grievances still shaping crofting life 7 decades later. The commissioners themselves, drawn largely from the ranks of the landowning and professional classes, did not always receive this testimony sympathetically, and surviving transcripts record several exchanges in which commission members pressed witnesses skeptically on points of detail or challenged the accuracy of memory passed down across multiple generations. Despite this occasional skepticism, the sheer volume and consistency of testimony gathered across dozens of separate communities, each describing broadly similar patterns of rent pressure, eviction, and coastal resettlement, made the Commission's final report difficult for the government to dismiss entirely, whatever its ultimate caution in recommending remedies. This testimony, gathered directly and preserved in an official government publication, made it substantially more difficult for landowners and their supporters to continue characterizing the clearances publicly as a program of agricultural improvement that had ultimately served the tenants' own interests. The tenants themselves, given the opportunity to speak in their own words before an official commission, described a very different history, one of loss rather than progress, and of poverty rather than modernization. The Napier Commission's final report, published in 1884, recommended significant legal protections for crofting tenants, though the specific proposals it contained proved more cautious in several respects than crofters and their advocates had hoped, particularly regarding the question of restoring access to land that had been cleared decades earlier. This caution frustrated many crofting communities, and it contributed directly to the formation, in 1883, of the Highland Land League, an organized political movement that coordinated crofter resistance across multiple islands and estates, and that would go on to elect its own members to Parliament within a few years. In the general election of 1885, candidates associated with the Highland Land League and running explicitly on a crofters' rights platform won several Highland and Hebridean parliamentary seats, an outcome that stunned much of the Scottish political establishment and demonstrated more clearly than any commission testimony could that Highland tenants now possessed a political voice their grandparents' generation had never held. These crofter members of Parliament pressed directly for stronger protections than the Napier Commission had recommended, and their presence in the House of Commons through the debates of 1885 and 1886 is credited by many historians with pushing the eventual Crofters Act toward provisions somewhat more favorable to tenants than the government's original proposals had contained. Parliamentary debate over how to translate the Commission's findings into law continued for 2 more years, against a backdrop of continued unrest in the Highlands and Islands and continued political pressure from land reform advocates across Britain. The Crofters Holding Scotland Act received royal assent in June of 1886, and it represented the first legally binding restriction the British government had ever placed on a Highland landowner's power to evict a crofting tenant. The Act established fixity of tenure for crofting tenants who met its qualifying conditions, meaning that a crofter could no longer be removed from his holding simply because his lease term had expired or because a landlord found a more profitable use for the land. It created a Crofters Commission, an official body empowered to set fair rents on crofting land, replacing a system in which rent had previously been set entirely at the landlord's discretion. It granted crofters a legal right to compensation for improvements they had made to their own holdings, a protection that had not existed under the property law in force throughout the entire preceding century of clearance. The Crofters Commission began hearing rent applications almost immediately after the Act took effect, and in its first years of operation it reduced rents on a substantial proportion of the holdings brought before it, in some districts by as much as 50%, while also canceling significant portions of accumulated rent arrears that had, in many cases, been used previously as grounds for eviction. The Act's protections applied only within a defined crofting area, largely limited to the counties and parishes most closely associated with subsistence crofting, and it left unresolved the broader grievance many communities still held over access to land beyond their existing and often still inadequate holdings. This unresolved grievance produced continued unrest even after 1886, including a series of illegal land raids on the island of Lewis in 1887 and 1888, when crofters from Perk and neighboring districts drove their own livestock onto deer forest ground the Crofters Act had not returned to them, deliberately testing the new law's limits and drawing further government intervention, including the deployment of a naval gunboat to the island for a second time within a decade. The 1886 Act did not reverse the clearances that had already occurred, and it did not restore cleared land to the descendants of families who had been removed from it. For the great majority of former tenant land converted to sheep farming across the preceding century, that land remained under pastoral use, and in many cases remains under some form of large-scale land management to the present day. What the Act accomplished, instead, was the legal termination of the clearance process itself, establishing for the first time a framework under which a Highland tenant's occupation of land carried genuine legal protection rather than depending entirely on a landlord's ongoing willingness to permit it. By the time this protection arrived, in 1886, the demographic transformation the clearances had produced was already, in the most basic sense, complete. The population removed from the interior straths and glens of the Highlands and Islands across more than a century of clearance had, by this point, settled into new lives across an enormous geographic span. Some remained in the crowded coastal crofting townships of Scotland itself. Others moved to industrial cities, including Glasgow and Edinburgh, and still others scattered across farming communities in Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and the Carolinas in North America, with substantial Highland Scottish settlements established across Australia and New Zealand through the 19th century's later decades. The scale and geographic reach of this dispersal is visible today in ways that extend well beyond historical record alone. Highland Scottish surnames remain common across large parts of eastern Canada, particularly in Nova Scotia, a name that itself, meaning New Scotland, reflects the density of Highland settlement that developed there through the emigration waves of the clearance period. Modern Canadian census data records well over 4 million people identifying at least some Scottish ancestry, a figure that includes but extends far beyond the direct descendants of clearance-era emigrants, and Nova Scotia alone retains a higher concentration of self-identified Scottish heritage than almost any other region outside Scotland itself. Highland Games, gatherings featuring traditional Scottish athletic competitions, piping and dancing, are held annually across North America, Australia, and New Zealand in communities founded by 19th century Highland emigrants, and the largest of these events now draw crowds many times larger than similar gatherings held in Scotland itself. The United States Congress designated April 6th as National Tartan Day in 1998, commemorating the anniversary of the 1320 Declaration of Arbroath and celebrating Scottish heritage broadly, a designation that draws directly, if somewhat loosely, on the same diaspora identity the Clearances helped create. Gaelic place names persist across regions of Canada and the United States settled by Highland emigrants, and Gaelic itself, though it had largely disappeared from everyday use in Scotland by the 20th century, survived as a living community language in parts of Nova Scotia's Cape Breton Island longer than in many regions of the Scottish Highlands the original speakers had left. Clan societies, genealogical organizations, and heritage tourism built around the history of specific Highland families and specific cleared estates now constitute a substantial and ongoing economic sector in modern Scotland, drawing visitors, many of them descendants of clearance-era emigrants, to sites including Strathnaver, Skye, and the ruins of townships cleared across the 19th century. The question of land ownership itself, the underlying issue the Clearances had turned on from the very beginning, has never fully left Scottish politics. In 1993, crofters in Assynt, on the northwest coast of Sutherland, where Francis Suther had overseen clearances more than a century and a half earlier, pooled their resources to purchase the North Lochinver estate directly from its owners, forming the Assynt Crofters Trust in one of the first successful community land buyouts in modern Highland history. The Assynt buyout succeeded only after a sustained fundraising campaign that drew donations from across Scotland and from the Highland diaspora abroad, including contributions from descendants of Highland emigrants in Canada, Australia, and the United States, a detail that closed a circle the Clearances themselves had opened nearly 2 centuries earlier. Families whose ancestors had been driven overseas, now helping fund their former neighbors' effort to reclaim the very ground their own families had lost. The island of Eigg followed in 1997, when its residents purchased their island outright after decades of absentee and often troubled ownership, and Knoydart itself, the estate cleared so severely during the famine years of 1853 and 1854, saw its own community buyout completed in 1999, placing land once emptied by force back under the control of the people living on it. By the early 21st century, community land ownership of this kind covered several 100,000 acres across the Highlands and Islands, a small fraction of the total land area involved in the original clearances, but a meaningful and symbolically significant reversal of a process that, for most of the preceding 2 centuries, had moved in only one direction. The Land Reform Scotland Act of 2003 established, for the first time in Scottish legal history, a community right to buy land in specific circumstances, giving crofting and rural communities a formal legal mechanism to purchase land from private owners, including, in a number of cases, since 2003, land originally cleared during the 19th century. A further Land Reform Act, passed in 2016, extended these provisions and placed additional requirements on large landowners regarding transparency of ownership and engagement with local communities. These provisions emerged directly from a modern political debate over land concentration in Scotland that traces its lineage, in a continuous line, back to the same question the Countess of Sutherland's estate planners had asked in the opening years of the 19th century: who has the right to decide what Highland land is used for, and who bears the consequences of that decision? The Highland Clearances did not end because the underlying economic logic that drove them was ever fully rejected. Sheep farming, and later large-scale sporting estates devoted to deer stalking and grouse shooting, remained profitable uses of Highland land well into the 20th century, and the commercial calculation that had justified clearance in the first place was never legally repudiated, only legally constrained. They ended because a population that had absorbed a century of loss organized itself, testified before a government commission in its own words, and forced a change in the law that no landlord goodwill had ever produced on its own. This has been Quiet History at Bedtime. If you found value in this story, a subscribe, a like, or turning on notifications helps this channel keep telling the histories that go untold. Thank you for listening and for letting this play through to the end. Good night and sleep well.